Hi, and welcome to the lecture on couples and attachment. This is one of my favorite lectures in this entire class. I never formally researched attachment, but it is an area of interest or expertise for me to some extent. I used attachment theory when I was a couples therapist. I trained in emotionally focused therapy for couples, which uses attachment theory as its base, and you're going to learn about that in our next lecture on interventions with couples. And I used to give couples workshops on this, and sometimes even workshops for students and their people as well. Attachment theory is one of the handful of theories, kind of like family systems, that I've really internalized and I used to view the world. I use it to understand my relationships with my husband, of course, but also my kids, my parents, my friends, and even my workplace interactions. This reading is from Sue Johnson, Dr. Sue Johnson, the creator of emotionally focused therapy for couples and one of the leading researchers on adult attachment in romantic relationships. I almost think she's the one who made it as famous as it is today. And so this chapter will really help you connect what you've learned about attachment in childhood to adult attachment in romantic relationships. This chapter by Zayas is about the formation of relationships and kind of the stages of attachment. This isn't something that we're going to talk about in this lecture, but in our upcoming PowerPoint on relationship formation. Okay, so if you haven't already, go ahead and stop and watch my TED Talk. It's 18 minutes, and I've designed this lecture with that TED Talk in mind, that you would have watched that first, kind of gotten the overview, heard some of my stories, gotten the big picture, and then I'll delve deeper into it in the rest of this lecture. So this is what we're going to be covering in this lecture. First, we're going to be talking about the ways that we're all the same. So the ways that attachment is universal across humans. Then we're going to be talking about the ways that we're different, our individual differences in the form of attachment styles, and how those relate to our behaviors in established relationships and also dating relationships. Then we're going to talk briefly about just the research on attachment security in romantic relationships, why it matters, why it's worth pursuing, why it's important. Then we're going to talk about how attachment feeds into common patterns of or cycles of distress in couples, like the pursue-withdraw pattern. And then I'll offer some attachment-based strategies for couples or for individuals for doing things differently and creating a deeper connection. The PowerPoint is definitely geared towards romantic relationships, but I think this information is relevant for family and friend relationships too. All right, let's get started with the ways that attachment is universal or the same for all of us. Attachment theory, as you know, was initiated and developed by John Bowlby, and his research, as well as the research of hundreds who have followed up, have really demonstrated that attachment is hardwired into us. It's in our genetics, it's in our brains and bodies, and we'll get more into that. It extends across our lifespans. It's not just caregivers and kids, and it's powerful. My own kind of powerful story of realizing the significance of attachment was when I was a doctoral student and I had just had a baby. And I was also training in emotionally focused therapy, which is attachment based, and delivering an emotionally focused therapy intervention developed by one of my professors. And so we were driving to and from the intervention site together often. And so one night on the way back, it's like 9 o'clock at night in the dark car, I confessed to her that I was worried that I was too attached to my mom. I had just noticed that after having this baby, after having Isaac, I suddenly was having this kind of strong desire for more conversation and time with my mom. And I was thinking, gosh, this seems odd. Maybe there's something wrong with me. It seems like I should be more independent than this. And I remember that Margaret said, in that quiet of the dark car, after I kind of, spilled my guts a little bit, she just said very simply, Ashley, we all need other people. And I remember just that weight kind of coming off my shoulders and realizing that I was normal, even though I was almost 30 and, I was married happily. There was nothing wrong with needing my mom. And in fact, now what I understand about attachment theory is during times of stress and transition, our attachment needs go up. And it makes sense now that I would have been looking to my mom for kind of more support. In addition to my husband, of course, and others, but particularly my mom during that time. John Bowlby said these 4 attachment behaviors are basically innate survival mechanisms. They emerge around 6 months of age, and they're with us in some form throughout our lives. You may have learned about these in a child development class focused on parents and kids, but here I'll talk more about what they look like for adults. So the first one, proximity maintenance. This is basically keeping tabs. This can be hellos and goodbyes. Generally with your important people, if you're in the same house with them, you don't just leave the house without saying goodbye. You don't just come home without saying hello. When we often want to know, when are you coming home? And if you're not home, we're kind of checking to make sure you're okay. We're following you on Find My or something like that. We're keeping tabs on you. When we're traveling, I don't know how about you, but how many texts have you sent that said landed? I text that all the time to my kids, my husband, my parents, every time that I'm flying, for example. So that's proximity maintenance, keeping tabs. Safe haven is how when something stressful or distressing, scary happens, we seek comfort verbally, physically, emotionally. And so, just for example, if you were to come out of class and someone had stolen your bike or your car, in addition to calling the police, you would probably be texting or calling your people, right? And you might even have a little hierarchy in your mind of who you're going to try first and who you're going to try second. This is your attachment hierarchy, essentially. Separation distress. Obviously, we don't want our significant people, we don't want to have to be apart from them. We don't want to have to, have them leave us. But so that's the actual separation, physical separation distress. But also there's perceived separation. So maybe we're in the same house, but I'm feeling disconnected from you. And so we're going to be monitoring our connection. And then if that person isn't connected to us, we might be kind of protesting that in some way. And we're going to get more into some examples of that. And in fact, we know if we're with our partners and we're not feeling connected, this can have negative physical effects, such as higher blood pressure. All right, so then secure base. This is the idea that with secure attachment, independence and dependence go together. They're the flip sides of the same coin. Dependence isn't a bad thing. In fact, you need people you can rely on to have confidence to go out into the world and do your good work. To be successful. However corny it is, this is like the song, "You Are the Wind Beneath My Wings," right? Because of you, I can do these things. You're my safety net. I don't know how many Mother's Day, Father's Day, birthday cards I've written to my parents just thanking them for being there for me, essentially, knowing that I could rely on them, being my safety net, giving me such peace of mind in that way. And you might notice that if you've got a disruption with one of your attachment figures and they're not a secure base at this time, maybe there's been a conflict, it can be hard to focus on your work or your schoolwork or whatever it is, because you don't have that kind of solid foundation. Okay, so test yourself on this iClicker, read it through, and the correct answer for this one is safe haven. So let's focus more on one of those 4 attachment patterns, separation distress. And so Bowlby said that with separation distress, we can see a predictable pattern, both in kids and in adults. And that's this protest, despair, detachment. And so protest initially can be angry protest, especially like in adults, like complaining about something, or it could be, more tearful, more hurt feelings, could be kind of pulling away to some extent, but kind of we're sensing that there's a disconnection and our behavior is kind of exemplifying that, is showing that. And then if we can't successfully resolve that, like if you don't get me when I'm expressing myself, or you don't see that I seem shut down and reach out and repair, then we might move into more kind of sadness about this separation, right? This perceived separation, even though we're, physically in the same place. Maybe we feel kind of hopeless, like here we are again, we never can get this figured out. Might affect our sleep, things like that. But it's hard to stay in a despairing, sad place. And so eventually we're going to detach. It kind of looks like we're fine as a couple. We look like we're okay. And we kind of retreat into our tasks or our chores or other people or our work or our phones, Yet it can quickly spark back up, right? When we try to come together again, it feels like, there's kind of something between us, or the issue might kind of re-arise. So we're not truly connected, even though we look like we seem to be fine. And so just a quick example of how I noticed, my husband and I would notice this when I had young kids and my husband would travel. It was obviously hard. He'd be gone for maybe a week at a time. And so on that first day, I noticed, or before he left, I would notice even the protest, like, don't go, don't leave me. This is going to be hard. It's going to be stressful. And then he would leave and I would kind of move into that despair, missing him. The kids would too. That first day was often hard for all of us. Like, I miss Daddy, they would say. Everybody's kind of sad and out of sorts. But then in the second day, we'd start to move into, sorry, cough attack. But on the second day, we really got into our groove, and we were kind of more in that detachment. We're doing fine. But when we would talk on the phone, like, oh, I can't wait to have you home, kind of that longing. And what I would notice on the reunion is that when Jordan walked through the door, two things happened at once. First, I was like, oh, I'm so glad to see you, this relief, right? And then the second one right on the heels was, and I'm furious that you left me. And now you used to joke about it. You have to do all the chores and be perfect for 24 hours, and then maybe I'll trust you again. And Bowlby actually documented a similar response for kids who had to be separated from their parents and hospitalized, that they seemed fine while they were in the hospital, but once they were reunited with their parents, all this kind of protest, angry behavior, a sense of abandonment came up again. Also, what I'll say is this pattern of protest, despair, and detachment occurs in short-term conflict, like we've kind of talked about, and it can also be the long-term pattern that people experience when their relationship ends. For a while, they're complaining, they're trying to kind of get their needs met and get things worked out, and then they start to grieve the relationship that they're not going to have, and then they start to detach and begin to move on. So when I went over this neurobiology of fear and attachment in the TED Talk, but let's break it down a little bit more. So we experience a threat. In the TED Talk, I talked about getting into trouble at work. So that's number one. And that pathway is going to turn on. Your amygdala is going to fire up, which is your fear system, and say kind of danger. And it's going to activate your sympathetic nervous system. Your hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis is going to kind of mobilize your body, put you a little bit into action, fight or flight. And that's then that's number two. If we jump over to 3A, if we seek out a supportive partner or person during this time, maybe like a romantic partner or a friend, then that's going to turn on our attachment system. Also our hypothalamus, we're going to release oxytocin. That's going to kind of calm us down. And we might actually reach out to that person and have a conversation over text or phone or in person, or we might imagine like, okay, this is really stressful right now, but later today I'm going to debrief this with so-and-so, and I know, and so just thinking about them and imagining the conversation you have can also turn on your attachment system and help you calm down. So that's 3A. If you don't basically automatically reach out to someone, in that pattern 3B, just being in that fight or flight state is going to make your body basically release oxytocin to prime you to attach to someone. So research says, if you, for example, inhale oxytocin, you feel more affectionate, you feel more closer to the people around you. So if you don't seek it out, your body's going to kind of make you seek out other people, which is why I always think like when you're traveling, in an airport or on an airplane and everything's going fine, no one talks to anybody. But the instant like there's a crisis or something scary or everything's delayed, everybody starts talking to each other, right? Because the stress almost makes us turn to each other and connect. So that's the 3B pattern. And so that attachment system is then, however it gets turned on, is going to, that's 3B and 4B, basically. And then that attachment system is going to downregulate our fear system, however it gets turned on. And then, as I mentioned in the TED Talk, like if your partner is the source of threat. And of course, the extreme examples of this are intimate partner violence, but it can also be your partner's not getting you, they're rolling your eyes while you're talking, they're showing signs of disapproval. Then you are kind of in this bind. You have this desire to move towards them because they're your attachment, but you also want to pull away because now they're almost what's triggering your response. And I think that explains a lot of the challenges in our romantic relationships. So here's an example of how, neurobiologically our attachment systems can calm our fear systems. So this was a couple of studies exploring how bodies responded to stress or fear or pain in the presence or absence of attachment figures. And so what they did is they put people in fMRI scanners, which are those little tubes that make people feel claustrophobic, to kind of create a fear response. And then they also told them that they could expect some light shocks on their toes to like even amplify the fear. And then they randomly assigned them to one of three conditions: holding no one's hand, holding the hand of a stranger, or holding the hand of their partner, as they were anticipating these possible shocks in the fMRI machine. And what they found is that in people's brains, their fear systems were not as lit up, basically not as activated when they were holding their partner's hand, more so than their stranger's hand. But a stranger's hand was better than no hand at all, which is interesting about our kind of hardwiring for connection and the intertwining of these attachment and fear systems. Other researchers have found, for example, that looking at pictures of your loved ones during times of stress can help reduce negative emotions. Also, with these fMRI studies, they did Sue Johnson did another study with Bex and Cohn, in which they then put these couples through some sessions of emotionally focused therapy for couples, and then put them back in the fMRI scanner and found that they had even a reduced kind of threat or fear response once they'd kind of experienced a strengthened connection through EFT. So in addition to talking about kind of the neurobiology, this is also a nice example of that safe haven attachment behavior that Bowlby identified. So let's talk about the formation of attachment security and ideally kind of that safe haven relationship. Bex and Cohn call this the distress relief dynamic, and it's a newer model. And so basically, when we are in relation as babies, for example, we experience distress, we're upset. Hopefully our caregivers provide fairly responsive and quick, soothing support that brings us relief. And then ideally we keep repeating that dynamic, and that becomes a secure attachment. Similarly, as adults, if we have a friend or a romantic partner or a family member, if we're upset and we turn to them and they say or do things that bring us comfort, help us feel better, give us that support, we experience relief, then we keep going back to them, right? We know that they are a safe haven for us. And so that's more the making of a secure attachment. But sometimes this doesn't go well. So for example, if as a young child we're in distress and we don't get the support and the relief that we need, then this is how we begin to form what we're going to be talking about in terms of attachment styles. Our choices are either to amp up, kind of protest more loudly, which is the precursor of the anxious attachment style, or to kind of shut down, distract ourselves, focus on our toys or something else, which is kind of the hallmark of the avoidant attachment style. Similarly, when we are in adult relationships, again, if we're in the beginning stages and the person isn't providing kind of the support we need and we're not experiencing relief, then we often break up or distance from them as a friend or don't go to them when we're in distress. And I also think that this can show us how relationships can erode. Maybe initially you were supportive and I experienced relief, but now you're not getting me. And we keep going through this cycle not in a positive way, and our relationship's attachment starts to become more insecure and break down. So again, this is essentially kind of safe haven that we are ideally creating. So on that note, you might pause and think about a time related to this distress relief dynamic. An attachment figure has really helped you calm down, or an attachment figure has actually made you more stressed and the distress relief dynamic didn't go well. So I introduced internal working models on the TED Talk. And so Bowlby hypothesized that basically we mentally represent our experiences of attachment and our attachment figures as internal working models, and we carry these with us throughout our lives. And they can change over time, of course. And so we all have an internal working model of self, which is how lovable we are, or our fears around not being lovable or being shameful. And we have internal working models of others in terms of how trustworthy they are, and maybe our fears that we can't really rely on others. And as you might imagine, because we are kind of carrying these with us, they can actually influence not only how we relate with our own kids as we grow up, but also how we form relationships and our relationship quality. These can often become self-fulfilling prophecies. So if I have struggles in my internal working model of self, and I'm not so sure about my lovability, then I might come across as a little too clingy, right? And or anxious, and people might then distance from me, and then that just confirms that I'm not lovable. Or if I'm struggling, with my internal working model of others, and I think I can't really count on others, then I might hold my cards close to my chest. I might not tell the people who are even close to me kind of some significant things. And then when they find out, they feel betrayed. Like, you couldn't tell me that. You didn't tell me that. You held that back. And then they're angry at me, which just confirms for me that I can't trust others. And so these internal working models, while changeable, also have a lot of continuity and can kind of continue throughout our lives. As a therapist, I always found it interesting listening to how people explained problems. It gave me insight into their internal working model. Were they talking more like, oh, I screwed up, or, I wish I hadn't done that, I feel so bad? That's more that they're bigger on that internal working model of self that they maybe struggle with more. Or are they like, it was their fault, I couldn't count on them, they screwed up? Then it gives me insight that maybe they're struggling more with that internal working model of others. So you might pause for a second and think about which one you struggle with more. I struggle so much more with internal working model of self. If a class doesn't go well, my very first knee-jerk response is it must be my fault. And maybe later I think, okay, that wasn't about me after lots of processing, but my first thought is it's me. Okay, so now let's get into what is usually the most interesting part of this material, which is our attachment styles, how we can be different. Okay, so I introduced you to this, but just to remind you, when we think of attachment in adulthood, we think of these two overlapping continua: the degree of attachment-related anxiety you feel and the degree of attachment-related avoidance that you feel. And you can see that if you kind of put these two dimensions across each other perpendicularly, you formed 4 categories. And these correspond to the 4 attachment styles from childhood that you may have learned about, but to make things more challenging, we changed some of the names in adulthood. And I've even simplified some of the names here to be how we commonly refer to them. So people who are more secure are lower on anxiety and avoidance. People who are more anxious are lower on avoidance and higher on attachment-related anxiety. People who are avoidant are higher on attachment-related avoidance and lower on attachment-related anxiety. And then people who are fearful avoidant are higher on both. And so we're going to be going through in a little bit here kind of what this looks like in dating and established relationships. Before we go a lot further into the 4 attachment styles, I just want to talk about this idea of attachment styles as more continuous or the same across our lives, or as discontinuous or changing. So is it that, we have attachment security or insecurity in childhood and that continues in some way throughout our lives, or can it change? And this ties to this idea, is our attachment style like a stable trait, kind of like a personality trait, introversion, extroversion, this is how I am? Or is it more of a state, which is how Mary Ainsworth initially intended it, to just describe one dyad, one pair of people at any given point in time? And so in that way I could have secure attachment with, for example, my husband, but an insecure attachment with, my mom, and a secure attachment with my dad, and that kind of thing. So is it more of a state? Or maybe with the same person, I could start off with an insecure attachment with my husband, but eventually develop a secure attachment. And what I'll tell you is that the attachment literature really indicates evidence for both. maybe with a slight, leaning towards some continuity in our attachment styles over time. But you'll notice in the lecture that I kind of talk about them in both ways, sometimes as a state, sometimes as a trait. So related to it more as a state, as something that can change or be discontinuous, is this idea of earned secure, which is maybe you got the short end of the stick during childhood and you had attachment insecurity, but over time you find your way to an earned secure place. And so, for example, there was a research study of about 120 new mothers, and about 50% of those were classified as having a continuously secure attachment from childhood into adulthood. Some were about 40% were just classified as more consistently insecure, avoidant, or anxious. And then about 13% were classified as earned secure, meaning having started in an insecure place, but currently being in a more secure place. And so you might pause and think, like, how do you tend to think of attachment styles? Is it more of a stable trait, a changing state, or a mix of both? Kind of, it depends. So this was a qualitative research study designed to understand the pathways to earned security. And so it was 20 individuals who met the criteria for having a history of attachment insecurity, but then current evidence of earning security. And as I talk you through this model, the borders that are kind of darker or more bolded were more significant factors, and the ones that were dashed lined were, maybe important but not as significant. And so in terms of first, just the meta conditions of earning security, this is just kind of laying the foundation. People just talked about being just intentional about their self-awareness, their relationships, kind of working on those things, and that they oftentimes had to kind of make mistakes, overcome setbacks, do the hard work, stick with it, even if it was painful. That they had important kind of surrogate attachment figures. So maybe their, initial caregivers couldn't provide that attachment security, but they had other early safe adults, like an aunt, or maybe like God or their faith, or partners would become maybe a key attachment figure that could be secure, or mentors or friends. Using therapy, nearly all 20 reported attending therapy at some point. And then once they were really kind of beginning to make changes, that happened in two ways, interpersonally and then intrapsychically. So interpersonally is changes to relationships. So making peace with the past, for example, family of origin work around no longer striving for parents' approval, or setting boundaries with some family members, or forgiving, or trying to understand the caregiver from a new perspective. And then another piece might be taking small risks. Accepting support and opening up to partners or therapists, being more vulnerable or authentic. And then in terms of intrapsychic or within individual changes, changing their identity, redefining their identity. This isn't who I want to be anymore, reframing themselves in a positive light, not thinking of themselves as broken or not good enough in some way, and then giving up that victim mentality. So instead of focusing more on blaming those that hurt them in the past, they began just owning what they were responsible for, moving forward. So I hope, if you or someone is kind of got the short end of the stick, did not have attachment security, and is trying to kind of move towards earned security, hopefully this kind of provides a path. Okay, so test yourself on this one, and it is earned security. So as we've talked about, we have these two continua of attachment, either our attachment-related anxiety, which is your tendency to hyperactivate or amp up, meaning when you're upset, people know you're upset, or this continua around attachment-related avoidance, which is a tendency to deactivate or minimize, which is when you are in distress, you tend to tamp down, pull in, shut down, and it's hard for people to know how upset you are. Obviously, we all have some of these, but you might notice that, when you are in distress, you tend to go in one direction or another. And people who are classified as more securely attached tend to be lower on both of these. There's actually a lot of adult attachment measures. And so here's just an example of one, the Experiences in Close Relationship Scale, or ECRS, that I've used, both with couples in therapy and in couple workshops. And so to give you a sense of what the attachment related, the anxiety related items might be, it's things like needing a lot of reassurance. Your partner doesn't want to be as close as you do. You sometimes scare them away. You're afraid of them abandoning you. You're frustrated that they're not supporting you as much, and you're worried maybe that they don't care about you as much as you care about them. So if you're trying to kind of figure out what this attachment-related anxiety looks like, this gives you some examples. And these are the items related to avoidance. And an R means it's reversed scored. So if someone says it helps to turn to my romantic partner in times of need, disagree, that would be an indicator, because that's reverse scored. That would be an indicator of avoidance. So taking a look at this list will give you a sense of how attachment-related avoidance is conceptualized and measured. Okay, so first let's talk about attachment styles in established relationships and what these four look like. So in established relationships, people who have more attachment security, which is lower on both avoidance and anxiety, are able to more easily talk about their emotions with their partner. When something's not quite right, they're more able to give their partner the benefit of the doubt. So if their partner's running late, instead of thinking like you don't care, they're thinking, oh, I guess something just held them up, something important held them up, or they're, that's just them, they're always running late, it's not about me. They are able to, when they are in distress, seek support. And if their partner is in distress, they're able to provide comfort when the partner is needy, which is hard for all of us to do, but people who are more secure are able to hang in there a little bit better and not want to just like make it better, fix it, shut it down, right away. So let's talk about the avoidant attachment style in established relationships. So when people are higher on avoidance, that means that oftentimes they learned when they were young to distract or shut down when they were upset. And so this means that they might not always know what they're feeling or how much distress they're experiencing because they're minimizing it. So they tend to not seek support from a partner, or they might delay it a few days and kind of internalize it for a while. They often are more likely to find it difficult to provide support to a partner when the partner is needy or anxious, and they might just end up withdrawing at that time. It's almost like they kind of get in their head. Oftentimes, they're really afraid of getting it wrong, and they sort of overwhelm themselves and pull away. They tend to, again, minimize their hurts or dismiss them. They tend to restrict emotional expression, focus more on intellectualizing about the issue, or focusing more on tasks. Okay, so then the anxious attachment style, which, as you heard in the TED Talk, is the direction I can move in when I'm not in a more secure place. And so when we are higher on attachment-related anxiety, we tend to maximize or exaggerate our hurts. When we're upset, we're upset. We tend to be more hypervigilant to our partner's behaviors. So, wow, I noticed you were really laughing and having a great time with our neighbor, having fun with her. What's that mean about me and about us? More demanding of time or support, expecting our partners to meet our needs, and more, kind of intense, observable, obvious emotions. Okay, so let's talk about fearful avoidant attachment style. So if early in our lives the people that we should have been able to trust weren't that trustworthy and they were abusive, or they were preoccupied with their own trauma, or they were struggling with substances, or they left us, then we can find ourselves in this place where we really are longing for connection that maybe we've never really had, but we're also afraid of it, afraid that we can't trust it. We can't trust the people, so there's more of this push and pull. And I'd say about 10% of the population, rough estimate, might be in the fearful avoidant category in terms of attachment styles. So obviously not everyone who experiences trauma ends up being in the fearful avoidant category. Okay, let's transition into talking about attachment styles in dating relationships. Okay, so let's talk about attachment styles in dating relationships. And as you read through this, you may be able to relate to some of these. I know I can. And so it's kind of a chance to check ourselves on some of our maybe knee-jerk kind of behaviors in dating relationships. So those of us who are more anxious in dating relationships, we tend to worry more about being rejected, focus on getting our needs met, kind of want connection and closeness, maybe come across as a little bit too needy, overeager, which can kind of push our partners away. We can disclose too much negative information about ourselves. And I've been, this has been something that I've been guilty of. Like, let me tell you all my flaws in our very first meeting. I tend to be a confessor. And I've had to learn to rein that in. We can think that the other person we're so similar and we're great. And, we overestimate that we're actually more similar than we really are. We can, in that balance between independence and dependence, sometimes we can look more dependent. We might want our partners to read our minds. We might think that it's more about us than it really is. We can worry more about our partners being kind of unfaithful. When we're not in a relationship, we can kind of really long for that. And in our own way, we can play games like we're not really cool, but we can try to pretend to be cool, to kind of keep our partner's interest. So people who are more avoidant in dating relationships can come across as more aloof or detached with some moments like a vulnerability. Um, and generally are less expressive, not sharing as much about themselves, even if maybe their partner or dating partner is. Not as willing to commit, thinking a lot about independence, can come across as kind of a player, maybe intentionally or unintentionally, kind of sending some mixed signals and using some distancing strategies, maybe like doing some mean teasing when things get a little too close to kind of keep their partner at a distance. Or not committing to when we're going to see each other again, not talking on the phone, which I know lots of people don't like to talk on the phone these days with texting. Fearing maybe the partner's going to take financial advantage of them, having a hard time hanging in there during conflict, and definitely kind of struggling to discuss the relationship, and the partner doesn't always know kind of how serious they are or where they stand. Okay, let's talk about the secure attachment style in dating relationships. It's kind of a way to highlight what we're aiming for if we're not there already. So people who are low on attachment-related anxiety and avoidance, generally in their dating relationships, are able to make plans and kind of stick to them, and kind of do that in conjunction with the partner. They're more flexible. They can talk about the relationship with the partner. They can talk to their partner if something's bothering them. When they're in conflict, they really want to understand, more so than prove that they're right. They're, a little less worried about the partner kind of impinging on their freedom or their independence, although I think it's normal to worry about that. But when they do get kind of close, even though they might get nervous sometimes, it doesn't lead to kind of big, distancing responses or being, overly clingy. Can introduce their partner to friends and family, naturally express positive feelings, less game playing, so they're less likely to keep you guessing or try to make you jealous. And then I love these last two. So the one about adjusting their self-disclosures based on how much their partner was sharing. This was a really good lesson for me, having, being an oversharer, to actually kind of read my partner. And if they're sharing more, I'll share more. If they're sharing less, I'll share less, and that for me goes for friendships mainly because I'm in a more established relationship. And then people who are more secure are able to strike that challenging balance in between separateness and togetherness in dating relationships with that, which I think is really tough and still hard, but maybe people who are secure do it a little bit better. All right, I'd encourage you to pause, take about 10 minutes, and do one of these attachment styles tests. So I'll tell you about them both so you can decide. The one on the left, you're going to answer, I think, 9 questions each time 4 times, one for a mother figure, one for a father figure, one for a friend, and one for a romantic partner. And then you're going to get this graph back with 4 data points on it to show you how your attachment style is in each of those 4 relationships. I find this one really interesting for kind of understanding if your attachment style is more like a trait, like you're all in one category no matter what, or is it more like a state in that it varies depending upon the relationship. The one from the book Attached is where you can take one for you and a potential romantic partner and kind of understand how compatible you might be. So even though you might be more of a secure attachment style, we all tend to have some directions that we move. So when you move towards insecurity, what style do you tend towards? More anxious, more avoidant, or a little bit of both? Okay, so you can weigh in on whether or not you think attachment styles really strongly differ by gender. And you'll notice that it's not really present in this lecture, gender differences in attachment styles, because generally we see patterns of similarity in terms of attachment styles across gender. So we stereotypically think that males tend to withdraw and females tend to kind of pursue. Males are more avoidant, females are more anxious. But what the attachment research says is that certainly there are women who are more avoidant and men who are more anxious, that it's not kind of the stereotype that we typically imagine. All right, so we're going to spend a few slides just talking about why attachment matters in romantic relationships. Research has consistently indicated that secure attachment is correlated with all the things that we typically want from our relationships: commitment, less likely to divorce, more satisfaction, less conflict, better communication. And so it tells us that as challenging as it is, working towards attachment security is worth it, and it's worth paying attention to. As you can see, people with insecure attachment styles during conflict don't do as well, right? They're not as effective. And I think that this is because they're not really arguing about what they think they're arguing about. So they think they're arguing about some content, the chores, where to go to dinner, where we're going to live. But what they're really arguing about are these deeper kind of underlying unspoken attachment needs, like, do I matter to you? Do you see me? Do you value me? Can I count on you? And until those get more explicitly addressed and resolved, they're going to have a hard time resolving whatever it is the content is. So I'll just tell you a quick story. I remember when I was a clinical supervisor observing a therapy session, there was a couple from the vet school, and they were struggling with what they were going to do after he graduated. She wasn't in the vet school, he was. He really wanted to go back to like Nebraska, where he was from, and be a veterinarian, a large animal vet in his hometown. And she was really struggling with this idea about moving to Nebraska, and they just argued about it. It was one of their unresolved conflicts. However, there was one key moment in a session where she was able to articulate, I'm just not sure what matters more to you, me, being with me, or moving to Nebraska. And he was like, oh, you matter more. I will choose you over Nebraska. And then she said, fine, I'll move to Nebraska, right? Because what they were arguing about is, do you really get me? Do I matter to you? And so until they resolved that, they couldn't resolve where to live. Now let's talk about some common cycles of distress for couples and how attachment styles can feed into that or help us understand these patterns. Okay, so separate from the adult attachment literature, researchers study patterns of conflict in couples, particularly the demand withdraw, also called the pursue withdraw pattern. And researchers have different theories for why this pattern emerges. Some people think that it's who has more power is more likely to be the pursuer or demander. Others, who the issue matters more to. So if it's an issue that matters to me, I'm more likely to be the pursuer. Gottman, as you learned, hypothesized that this was really about gender, that women are socialized to be the critical and contemptuous, which is kind of demand or pursue, and men are socialized to withdraw or stonewall. One kind of research study from a number of years ago found that in heterosexual couples, about 2/3 of the time, the male was the withdrawer and the female was the about two-thirds of the time male was withdrawer, but about a third of the time the female was the withdrawer and the male was the more demanding or pursuing partner. So where that might be this stereotypical pattern, we definitely see it a lot of times as reversed, and of course it exists for same-sex couples too. So how attachment theory fits in is that Sue Johnson said this demand-withdraw pattern, or withdraw-withdraw, or demand-demand, as we're going to get into, is really about your attachment styles. And this pattern also is, an example of separation distress, right? It gets activated when we perceive a loss of connection, or that the other person isn't really seeing us or getting us. And then if we are more of an anxious attachment style, that means that we are going to be more likely to be the demander or pursuer. If we are more of an avoidant attachment style, then we're more likely to be in that withdraw position. You might imagine that it's also relative to your partner. So when I used to give people the ECRS and give them their scores, I would say, okay, well, you have more attachment-related anxiety than you do, so you're more likely to be the pursuer, and you have more attachment-related avoidance than you, so you're more likely to be the withdrawer. However, if you partnered with someone else who had more avoidance than you, then maybe you would end up being in the pursuit position. So it's all a little bit relative, as you might imagine. Withdraw is likely to be two people with more avoidant attachment styles. Their fights are smaller, less frequent. They both tend to avoid. And demand or pursue is often two people with higher attachment-related anxiety, and they both can really go at it, and that can be particularly challenging for therapists when two people are really maximizing their distress. However, even in withdraw, and in demand, I still think sometimes you see a small pursue-withdraw pattern. One person withdraws more than the other, So even in this withdraw couple, one person's like, don't you think we should? The other person says, no. And then that's it, But one person was like, don't you think we should? And even in demand, one person might be able to hang in there longer than the other, and then, the other might eventually shut down. So, we will be talking more about demand withdraw or pursue withdraw as we move forward. And then it's also important to know that the withdrawer, whether a man or a woman, is more likely to pursue for sex. So that's where the pattern can get reversed, because that's one of the ways that they feel comfortable reaching out and trying to get connection, maybe through sex more than through kind of conversation or emotional connection. So demand withdraw is a systemic pattern, like we learned with family systems theory. So now we're basically merging family systems and attachment, and we're understanding how attachment styles might influence the positions that we have in this systemic pattern, right? And so in this case, Maya has more attachment-related anxiety than Gabby does, and so she's going to be in the pursue position. Gabby has more attachment-related avoidance than Maya does. She's going to be in more of the withdraw position. And so, of course, and then this is going to be their problem cycle that kind of keeps repeating unless they come up with some cycle breakers. So you might be thinking about, what you're more likely to be in your relationships, or if it varies. This slide is just a follow-up on this idea of attachment styles feeding a demand withdrawal pattern, and provides some evidence for that. So people who are more secure or lower on attachment avoidance and anxiety are less likely to have a high demand withdrawal pattern, an exacerbated demand withdrawal pattern in their relationship, although demand withdrawal patterns occur in almost all relationships, even secure ones. And you can see there that when people have an avoidant attachment style, it is associated with things that sound like withdrawing, less facial gaze, less attention, more distancing, more minimizing. And when people have an anxious attachment style, it's associated with things that sound more like pursue or withdraw. They're amping up, they're more expressive, they're ruminating, about the conflict. Okay, so test yourself on this one. And if you read it through, the answer would be pursuer. A. Okay, so now that we understand our attachment styles and we also know the research on why having a secure attachment can be so beneficial, let's talk about some strategies for how to create change and create secure attachment. So I've got a few slides on strategies for couples, and then we'll talk about strategies for individuals. So the first strategy for couples is just understanding, right? We all need other people, and that this person, whether it's your partner or someone else, is a key attachment figure for you. And it makes sense that you're having kind of strong feelings, towards them. The second is really understanding the cycle. And I've got another slide coming to help kind of map that out. But the more you can kind of understand your systemic pattern and talk about that and how your attachment styles feed into that, that really helps to change things. And then the last one there is beginning to understand your own underlying feelings. We're going to be getting into this some more with interventions with couples and talking more about EFT, but understanding your own underlying feelings and your attachment needs. And so often that's fears of being inadequate or abandoned, and our attachment needs of needing to be valued or seen. So as you're trying to understand your cycle as a couple, you can do it by just mapping out that circle like we did in family systems theory and I did earlier in this PowerPoint, but you can also just ask questions like, when we're not getting along, how do I react? Then how do they react to me? Then how do I respond to that? How do I see myself? What is it that I really need? What do I think it is that my partner's feeling? And so this can help us kind of get out of the content and get more into our process, which can really change the way we interact. So once we have a sense of kind of our underlying attachment related fears and needs, then we have to kind of take a risk and say it, even though we hate to do that. We want our partners to just know and read our minds. So you heard in my TED Talk when I was using that example of the road bike story, when I got to the top of the hill and Jordan was waiting for me, I said, I'm worried that you don't really want to be here with me, right? I'm expressing that fear, that I'm essentially unlovable or you're not enjoying me. And then Jordan was able to kind of, in his humorous way, like comfort or reassure me that he really did, want to be with me. If our partner is also expressing this to us, more vulnerability that we hadn't seen before, then it can take us a while. Like, who is that? Like, no, you don't really feel that way. Like, no, we don't always believe it initially that they're more hurt because we just thought they didn't care, and so it can take us a while to accept what they're telling us, accept this new side of them. And yes, of course, as is implied, we often are having to address our old, attachment relationships, for example, from family of origin or previous romantic relationships or friends, that might kind of old stuff that's influencing this current relationship, our internal working models, all of that. So here's some individual strategies just in general, and then we can talk about some individual strategies specific to anxious and avoidant attachment styles. So just in general, the more we can understand our attachment style, the better we are going to be able to move towards that attachment security if we don't have that. Knowing that even if we have attachment insecurity, we're more anxious or more avoidant, that we are normal and that other people struggle just like we do. We can start to tune into those internal working models of self and other and pay attention to when those get triggered, when we don't feel lovable or we don't feel like we can count on others, and kind of pay attention to what our kind of common responses are to that. Emotional literacy feeds in here. We're going to get to that more when we talk about emotionally focused therapy, but we are having to, in identifying our vulnerable emotions and our attachment needs and fears, that's a lot about emotional literacy. That idea that if you name it, you can tame it. Paying attention to what attachment styles you tend to gravitate towards. So for example, as someone who tends to be more on the anxious side, I'm really drawn to more avoidant people. And I think that's because I'm already overwhelming myself. And so I like people who aren't going to overwhelm me. But then I can still be critical at them for being more shut down and withdrawn. And then, of course, just talking about this, right, with family, friends, your partner, therapists, will help with moving towards attachment security. So if you're someone who's more on the anxious side, you just want to notice some of these tendencies in yourself. Basically, all these are kind of themes that your brain is moving too fast, it's spinning too intensely, you're having a lot of emotions about it, you're doing a lot of rumination, kind of a lot of worries and fears. and maybe some pursuing. And so you just want to kind of pay attention to these tendencies, kind of notice them, name them, maybe joke about them with someone else, right? Can help. To begin to kind of shift, right? So we have to kind of notice our instincts before we can change them a little bit. So for someone who is more avoidant, right, they're catching themselves in all of their kind of distancing strategies when they're starting to like tell this story like, oh, they're too needy, or oh, they've got these imperfections, I'm going to kind of distance from them. Or when they start kind of finding that they're kind of thinking about an ex or an unavailable person, or flirting with someone who's unavailable because that feels safer, right? And so I think a really helpful strategy for people who are more avoidant that I really like is just this idea that you might have a hard time with this, like, let's go out to dinner and stare at each other and talk. Like, that might be hard and stressful. But going on a hike or playing pickleball or sitting side by side or on a drive, like, that's maybe less stressful when you have an activity to distract you a little bit. So take a minute. I know we're near the end and your brain is full of all kinds of information, but just think, like, what are some strategies that you want to remember or talk to someone else about? So as part of this class, we have the opportunity to do an extra credit blog comment assignment based on an HDFS honors blog on romantic attachment. So over the last decade, I've had a lot of different honors students basically writing blog posts on romantic attachment. And for each one of those, they find someone to interview and they find a research article and then they put it together. So there's all kinds of fascinating posts around casual sex and daddy issues and rom-coms and long distance relationships and addiction. There's over 60 posts. And so you can go through and find some that you want to read and write one or more comments. You're going to want to use Google Chrome to do it, because otherwise it just doesn't seem to work right. And then you're going to, in addition to posting your comment on the blog, you're also going to put your comment in the Canvas assignment Dropbox. You can see Canvas for more details on how many of these you can do and how many points they're worth and what the requirements are. All right, one last eye clicker to test yourself on, and this answer is avoidant. In case you're interested in learning more, here's some references. Okay, you made it to the end. Great job. And I hope that you'll go off and just start to see attachment everywhere. In cards, that maybe say something like with Piglet and Pooh, in memes, in songs, in religion, in research that doesn't even know that it's about attachment. So put your attachment hat on and see where you can find it.